June 3, 1942. Early morning. The Pacific Ocean north of Midway Atoll was calm, empty, and deceptively quiet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy Combined Fleet, believed he had engineered the decisive moment of the war. 6 months earlier, his aircraft carriers had shattered American power at Pearl Harbor. Now he was preparing to finish what that strike had begun. The plan was elegant, precise, and grounded in every lesson Japanese naval doctrine had validated for decades. Lure the remaining American carriers into battle. Destroy them in a single overwhelming blow. Secure Japan's defensive perimeter. Force the United States into a negotiated peace. By every traditional measure of naval warfare, the logic was sound. What Yamamoto could not see was that the war he was preparing to fight no longer obeyed the rules he trusted. Victories Isoroku Yamamoto was not a reckless commander. He was one of the most experienced naval officers Japan had ever produced. Educated in the United States, fluent in English, and deeply familiar with American industrial power, he understood that Japan could not win a long war of attrition. His solution was speed, shock, and decisive battle. This belief was not ideological. It was professional. Japanese naval doctrine since the early 20th century revolved around Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement. Weaken the enemy through attrition, then annihilate their main force in one climactic battle. Tsushima in 1905 had proven the concept. Japan had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in a single encounter, securing its place as a great power. Yamamoto's entire career reinforced this logic. He had commanded carrier aviation when it was still experimental. He had watched aircraft replace battleships as the primary instrument of naval power. Pearl Harbor was not an act of impulse. It was the application of doctrine to modern technology. But Yamamoto also knew Pearl Harbor had failed in one critical respect. The American aircraft carriers had not been present. Those carriers now represented the core of U.S. naval power in the Pacific. Until they were destroyed, Japan could not secure its conquests. Midway was designed to solve that problem. Midway Atoll was small, isolated, and strategically valuable. Its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and threaten Hawaii. More importantly, it would force the Americans to respond. Yamamoto believed that U.S. commanders, humiliated by Pearl Harbor, would rush their carriers forward to defend Midway. The Japanese plan reflected meticulous planning. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway first, neutralizing its defenses. When American carriers appeared, a second wave would destroy them. Yamamoto's battleships and cruisers waited farther west to deliver the final blow. On paper, the balance of forces favored Japan. Japan deployed 4 experienced carriers with veteran air crews hardened by months of combat. The Americans could muster only 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Japanese pilots were better trained. Their torpedoes were superior. Their operational coordination had proven deadly across the Pacific. Nothing in Yamamoto's experience suggested this plan would fail. What the Japanese plan did not account for was something no fleet commander could see from a map. By 1942, the United States was no longer fighting as a collection of ships and squadrons. It was fighting as a system. American codebreakers had penetrated key elements of Japanese naval communications. Through months of patient analysis, U.S. intelligence officers identified AF as Midway. A carefully staged deception confirmed it. The Americans knew the attack was coming. They knew its timing. They knew its direction. This knowledge fundamentally altered the battle before the first aircraft launched. American carriers did not rush blindly toward Midway. They moved deliberately, positioning themselves northeast of the island, exactly where Japanese doctrine said they should not be. The Americans were not reacting emotionally. They were executing a plan built on information superiority. Yamamoto assumed the enemy would behave predictably. Instead, the enemy behaved systematically. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway as planned. The attack was effective, but incomplete. The airfield was damaged, not destroyed. Yamamoto's carrier commander, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, faced a decision shaped by doctrine and habit. Should he prepare a second strike against Midway or rearm his aircraft to attack American carriers if they appeared? Doctrine emphasized readiness for the decisive fleet engagement. Aircraft were cycled between configurations. Torpedoes were removed. Bombs were prepared. Decks filled with fueled aircraft and exposed munitions. This was standard procedure. It had worked before. What Nagumo did not know was that American dive bombers were already inbound. The American attack that followed was disorganized, costly, and poorly coordinated by traditional standards. Torpedo squadrons attacked piecemeal and were annihilated. Pilots died without scoring a single hit. But the system absorbed those losses. Minutes later, dive bombers arrived at altitude, unopposed. Japanese decks, crowded with fueled aircraft and ordnance, became targets of opportunity. In a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were fatally damaged. Fires spread uncontrollably. Control was lost. The battle did not turn because Americans were braver or more skilled. It turned because the Japanese carrier force had no margin for error, and the American system was designed around redundancy. By the afternoon, Hiryu launched a counterattack and damaged Yorktown. But the pattern had already asserted itself. American reconnaissance, repair capacity, and coordination continued functioning despite losses. Japanese operations grew fragmented. When Hiryu was finally located and destroyed, Japan lost not just a ship, but an entire ecosystem of trained pilots, maintainers, and command experience. Yamamoto understood the implications almost immediately. Japan could replace ships, slowly. It could not replace aircrews, training pipelines, or operational flexibility at scale. The Americans could. The Battle of Midway was not decided by one strike or one decision. It was decided by structural realities. American industry produced aircraft carriers, aircraft, and pilots at rates Japan could not match. American logistics sustained damaged ships, rotated crews, and integrated intelligence into operations. American command systems allowed decentralized initiative informed by shared information. Japan's system was optimized for excellence, not endurance. Once that excellence was broken, there was nothing behind it. Yamamoto survived Midway, but the war he feared had arrived. A long conflict against an enemy whose strength lay not in any single fleet, but in production, information, and replacement. Less than a year later, Yamamoto himself would be killed by American aircraft guided by intelligence interception. The system that defeated his fleet would erase its architect as well. Midway did not end the Pacific War, but it ended the illusion that it could be won by decisive battle alone. In modern war, brilliance can shape events, but systems decide outcomes.